The Covenant of the League of Nations was the Charter of the League of Nations. Creation. Early drafts for a possible League of Nations began even before the end of the First World War. A London-based study group led by James Bryce and G. Lowes Dickinson made proposals adopted by the British League of Nations Society, founded in 1915. Another group in the United States, which included Hamilton Holt and William B. Howland at the Century Association in New York City, had their own plan. This plan was largely supported by the League to Enforce Peace, an organization led by former U.S. President William Howard Taft. In December 1916, Lord Robert Cecil suggested that an official committee be set up to draft a covenant for a future league. The British committee was finally appointed in February 1918. It was led by Walter Phillimore but also included Aircrow, William Tyrrell, and Cecil Hurst. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was not impressed with the Phillimore Committee's report, and would eventually produce 3 draft covenants of his own with help from his friend Colonel House. Further suggestions were made by Jan Christian Smuts in December 1918. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, a commission was appointed to agree on a covenant. Members included Woodrow Wilson, Colonel House, Robert Cecil and Jan Smuts, Elia Couto N. Bourgeois and Ferdinand Larnaud, Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando and Vittorio Cialoia, Foreign Minister Makino Nobuaki and Shinda Tsutami, Paul Hymans, Epitatio Pessoa, Wellington Koo, Jamie Batalla Race, and Milenko Rado Marvesnich. Further representatives of Czechoslovakia, Greece, Poland and Romania were later added. The group considered a preliminary draft written by Hearst and President Wilson's advisor David Hunter Miller. The group met on 10 occasions, and by the 11th of April 1919, the Hearst-Miller draft was approved with only a few changes. The League would be made up of a General Assembly, an Executive Council, and a permanent Secretariat. Member states were expected to respect and preserve as against external aggression the territorial integrity of other members, and to disarm to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. All states were required to submit complaints for arbitration or judicial inquiry before going to war. The Executive Council would create a permanent court of international justice to make judgments on the disputes. Major objections came from France and Japan. France wanted the League to form an international army to enforce its decisions, but the British worried such an army would be dominated by the French, and the Americans could not agree since only Congress could declare war. Mackinac and Shinda requested that a clause upholding the principle of racial equality should be inserted, parallel to the existing religious equality clause. This was deeply opposed, particularly by Americans, and Wilson simply ignored the question. While Wilson was away, a vote on a similar motion was supported by 11 of 19 delegates, but Wilson declared that serious objections by other delegates negated the majority vote, and the amendment was dismissed. The treaty entered into force on the 10th of January 1920. Articles 4, 6, 12, 13, and 15 were amended in 1924. The treaty shares similar provisions and structures with the UN Charter. Article 10. Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations is the section calling for assistance to be given to a member that experiences external aggression. It was signed by the major peacemakers following the First World War, most notably Britain and France. Due to the nature of the article, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was unable to ratify his obligation to join the League of Nations, as a result of strong objection from U.S. politicians. Although Wilson had secured his proposal for a League of Nations in the final draft of the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. Senate refused to consent to the ratification of the treaty. For many Republicans in the Senate, Article 10 was the most objectionable provision. Their objections were based on the fact that, by ratifying such a document, the United States would be bound by international contract to defend a League of Nations member if it was attacked. Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts and Frank B. Brandegee from Connecticut led the fight in the U.S. Senate against ratification, believing that it was best not to become involved in international conflicts. Under the United States Constitution, the President of the United States may not ratify a treaty unless the Senate, by a two-thirds vote, gives its advice and consent.